Hello, and welcome to this installment of GPS's webinar series, Designing Policy for a Global Impact. In collaboration with UC San Diego Alumni and Graduate Division, and in celebration of the school's 30th anniversary, GPS has launched this monthly webinar series to explore the school's research findings and their impact on policy choices across the globe. Each webinar features GPS and UC San Diego faculty, alumni, and graduate research students, and we'll take a closer look at a topic currently under discussion in the public domain. Today, we'll be looking at how regulatory decisions made early on in a general purpose technology's life cycle can impact long-term innovation trends. We will do this in the context of specific cases and in particular by discussing potential FDA responses to 3D printing in medical devices. Joining me in this discussion today are Dr. Stayce Beck, Dr. Robert Friedman, and Karcher Morris. Dr. Beck received her Ph.D. in biomedical sciences from UCSD and worked in several departments at the FDA, including as Deputy Office Director of Personalized Medicine and Molecular Genetics for over 10 years. She is currently the Vice President of Clinical and Strategic Partnerships at Dexcom, which is a continuous glucose monitoring firm headquartered in San Diego. Dr. Friedman received his Ph.D. in Ecological Systems Analysis from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is currently the Vice President for Policy and University Relations at the J. Craig Ventnor Institute in La Jolla, where he has led research projects on regulatory responses to innovations in biology and biotechnology. He is also a professor of practice at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UCSD. Karcher Morris is currently pursuing his Ph.D. in Mechanical Engineering at UCSD. His research focuses on medical device design, including 3D printed medical device design. He was awarded a position as a Science Policy Fellow at the School of Global Policy and Strategy to pursue research on policy related to 3D printing of medical devices. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work with Karcher on this problem, and our research is largely what it motivated the topic of this panel. So, when Karcher approached me with his interest in understanding how policy and regulation was going to impact the evolution of 3D printed medical devices, he pitched this wonderful idea of perfectly personalized medical devices in which 3D printers could be located in every doctor's office and every medical device could be printed on demand at the time of need and according to the patient's specifications. And I thought that was a very interesting proposition. He also suggested the possibility for medical devices to be produced around the world. And so that would significantly reduce the transportation costs associated with using medical devices. But of course, there are regulatory barriers to that actually happening. Patient safety is obviously important. Doctors are not experts in 3D printing, and it's not clear they ever will be. And so we've been looking at how the FDA has begun responding to the introduction of 3D printed medical devices. And so we wanted to share some of that, but also get insight from people who are also either working in this field or have looked at similar uncertain regulatory environments as a result of new technologies. So I wanted to start this off by asking Dr. Beck to give us a summary of her understanding of medical device manufacturing regulation at the FDA, which of course she worked for 10 years. So we're very lucky to have these insights provided by her.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm sharing a couple of slides to kind of help with the presentation, so please let me know if these are going through or not. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about how medical devices are regulated at the FDA. So I will talk a little bit about from the pre-market side and then as well as from the manufacturing a little bit. So, FDA regulates a variety of medical devices. These can include things as ubiquitous and simple as tongue depressors and Band-Aids, as well as complex devices like a robotic surgical instrument or a pacemaker. So often people ask, how does the FDA regulate such a wide variety of devices? The answer is that the amount of regulation needed is decided by the risk of the device. The device gets classified by its risk, which is based on the intended use of the device and the risk of a false result or how it would be used. There are 3 classification levels. The first level is for the lowest risk devices and is called Class 1. This includes things like elastic bandages, and these often do not have to be submitted to the FDA for pre-market review prior to selling. Class 2 devices are more complex and have a moderate level of risk. These include things like a glucose meter or a pregnancy test. These generally require pre-market review through a 510(k) submission. The most complex devices with the highest level of risk are called Class 3. These account for about 10% of devices and includes implantable pacemakers. Devices with new technologies that have never been seen before are usually considered Class 3 devices until their risk can be determined. Class 3 devices have to be approved through a pre-market application or PMA prior to marketing. When FDA reviews a pre-market submission, they're evaluating the device to see if it is safe and effective. Safety is defined as the probable benefits of the device outweigh the risks, and data should demonstrate that there is an absence of unreasonable risk of illness or injury associated with the device for its intended uses and conditions of use. Effectiveness is defined as there being a reasonable assurance that the device will provide clinically significant results in a significant portion of the target population when the device is used for its intended use and conditions of use. Most Class 2 devices must submit a pre-market notification, which is called a 510(k) submission. These submissions must be reviewed by the FDA in 90 days. Clearance of these applications by the FDA is based on something called substantial equivalence to a legally marketed device, which is referred to as the predicate. So basically, this means that the FDA evaluates how well the new device compares when you compare it to an older device that is sold on the market. They typically look to see that the new device and the old device share similar intended uses as well as performance characteristics. The predicate and the new device do not have to have identical technologies, but some 510(k) submissions do require clinical data, while others do not. Pre-market applications, or PMAs, have a 180-day review clock at the FDA, and the bar for approval is much higher than for Class 2 products. The standard requirement for a PMA is that a device demonstrates safety and effectiveness. Unlike Class 2 devices, PMA device performance is not compared to a legally marketed device, but rather the applicant must provide sufficient data to demonstrate safety and effectiveness for the device as it is intended to be used. This means that they often have to compare the device to a gold standard or clinical diagnosis. Also, unlike Class 2 devices, PMA devices must be inspected by the FDA prior to approval to ensure that the manufacturing facility is adequately set up to ensure quality manufacturing of the device. Often, PMA submissions include clinical data, and FDA may seek advisory panels to assist in the approval process. To promote transparency, a summary of safety and effectiveness data is posted publicly on the FDA website that can be accessed by anybody. I've described some of the ways that medical devices come to market, but how does the FDA ensure that the devices on the market continue to be safe and effective? The quality system is one way to ensure that devices consistently meet their requirements. The quality system is also known as Current Good Manufacturing Practices, or GMPs. Manufacturers must establish and follow procedures that meet the requirements of the quality system for their device. The quality system is flexible. It doesn't tell manufacturers how to do something, just what needs to be done so that the manufacturer can establish the most appropriate procedures for their device to ensure safety and efficacy. So a question that often comes up is, how does the FDA communicate expectations with industry and the general public? One way that FDA communicates is through guidances, but it's important to note that guidances are not the same thing as regulations or laws. Congress sets legislation, and this goes through the bill-making process. This legislation establishes the legal framework in which FDA operates, and an example is the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act, whereas regulations are actually created by the FDA, and they are intended to implement the laws that Congress passes. These do not go through the bill-making process. However, they do go through the notice and comment rulemaking process, which allows for public input. An example is Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. Finally, guidances really establish the agency's thinking on a regulatory issue. They are not binding to the public or agency. An example is the Technical Considerations for Additive Manufactured Medical Devices draft guidance that was released in 2017, which deals with some of the 3D printing topics. For general understanding, I'd just like to give you a quick overview of the general guidance process. The FDA publishes many guidances a year. The guidance process involves soliciting input from the community by talking to leaders in the field, including academics, patient advocacy groups, and professional societies. After writing the guidance and going through several layers of review, they release the draft guidance to the public. It's important to remember that draft guidances are never enforceable. This is the time that FDA is able to get feedback from everyone involved, including the patient community. The docket is open for several months for comments. The comments are then reviewed, and another public meeting can be held if needed. Finally, the guidance is revised based on the feedback, and the final guidance is released to the public. The comment period of the guidance process is one of the main ways that people can interact and provide feedback to the FDA. Often public meetings are held, and all comments to the docket are reviewed and considered before finalizing a guidance. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
That was awesome. Thank you, Stacey. I learned a ton from that. I think this distinction between the risk of the medical devices is very important in the case of all medical devices, but in the case of 3D printing in particular, Karcher is going to tell us about all the stages of 3D printing that pose risk, leave the chance for error open. And I'll just say that what Karcher and I have done so far in terms of our research is try to look through 510Ks that include mention of additive manufacturing or 3D printing. And the rate of this is incredibly low given how developed the 3D printing technology is. And hopefully we can get more into why that might be further in the discussion. So right now, Karcher is going to tell us all about 3D printing and in particular, everything that can go wrong.
All right, thank you, Liz. Yeah, no, I am very happy to be on the panel, one, to discuss this topic because it's very relevant to my research now as a mechanical engineering graduate student. I'm currently in Jacobs School of Engineering in Professor Talka's biomedical device research lab. And we've been digging into the issues of how can we take a product that we develop in the lab and actually make it marketable and useful and have an impact. And 3D printing is a big part of what we're doing because we want to rapidly prototype these devices and we want to work with medical doctors as we do that. I think overall, Liz mentioned, we're trying to discuss between innovation and regulation, kind of how those balance each other out. And I think when it comes to 3D printing, there's a lot of hype, a lot of things going on in 3D printing outside of even medical devices, of course, that I think I've seen at UC San Diego, the campus change drastically, especially in the engineering realm, from having 10 years ago only a few 3D printers to now having hundreds. And I think that difference, again, is impactful because instead of just having a model and a design, you're able to put something in your hands and actually work with it. In the medical community, this has been a big deal too. So when it comes to, I want to say the early on stages of 3D printing in medicine were driven by the radiology departments. So they would look at a lot of anatomical models for the most part. And again, you could have a nice CT scan or an X-ray on the screen, but it's very different if you're preparing for a procedure or surgery to have something 3D in your hands that you're able to think spatially as you prepare for such a procedure. I think early on there was a lot of drive there, and then medical devices, it came in with things like personalized medicine. That was a big deal. Complex geometry is another reason why I'd be, I think these things I want to talk about more later, but medical devices is a big deal. And then of course there's biologics, being able to start to include things like stem cells. I think there's a lot of research in that area where we're probably a ways from having a 3D printed heart. But even on UCSD's campus, there's a lot of influence and changes that I hope to see cool things happen there. So I think bringing in 3D printing and the FDA's view is the FDA, of course, as Stacey mentioned, is very focused on safety, but also innovation. And I think in balancing those two, again, they try and provide a lot of guidance. In that guidance, as Professor Lyons and Professor Bone, my other mentor, as we dig into it, there's a realm of uncertainty. And 3D printing particularly, I just kind of wanted to give you some of where that is. I could get into the details of that, and I think Professor Lyons mentioned that I probably shouldn't too far because I like the details of 3D printing. But generally, if you look at the guidance, the technical guidance that the FDA gave on 3D printing, is they talk a lot about that quality system that Dr. Beck mentioned. The quality system, they try and show is just a figure, a workflow. So you have your process that takes place. And in that, for a 3D printing to be considered, is you have the 3D printing technology, and you have your inputs to that 3D printer. That could be materials or that could be design. And then you have your post-processing. In all of those areas, you can have uncertainty. So it's not just the 3D printing process, that there is a lot, but it's all these components of the workflow. When it comes to the process and the technology itself, there's a bunch of technologies, and I think I'll just name a few for example. One is what's called fused deposition modeling. This is like a hot glue gun in a way. So instead of extruding hot glue, though, you're extruding a thermoplastic or some type of thermoplast material. And like a hot glue gun again, you could squirt out this material and layer by layer produce a geometry. So that's how one technology works. Another technology works it's called, it would be with photopolymer resin, where you're able to take a bath of photopolymer resin. It would be a liquid, and you shine a UV laser light, and you're able, through the stereolithography process, be able to build geometry as that material hardens. Again, it goes layer by layer. Another technology could be considered like inkjet printing, where you could spray photopolymer resin, a liquid, and again, with UV light, cure it layer by layer. Another technology is like powder bed fusion, where you have metal powder, and through some type of laser sintering process, you're able to melt it, and again, layer by layer, produce geometry. My point of that rant is that just in the technologies alone is that there's many different types of 3D printing. And for the FDA to bring a group of people together to create a guidance is quite a challenge. I think they've done as good as they can do in the time being, because this technology changes from year to year as well. And I think in trying to identify these errors and these difficulties that come in the process of that, they put a lot on the manufacturer to define it and expect a lot of performance-based reviews on how their technology meets a need or is comparable to a predicate. I hope that kind of gave an overview of 3D printing.
It was really helpful. I think that, so there's a lot of variation in the technology itself. There's variation in the software that you use to design the output and the material, as you said, and then in how you test the efficacy of the output. And so what I found really interesting in talking to Karcher is that if we imagine at some, future state of the world, every doctor has their own 3D printing, they have to be programming experts, design experts, material scientists, they have to have on-site testing facilities. And so all of this makes, as Karcher said, regulation very complex. But if we do want to encourage innovation in that direction, it's not clear where the line is for the FDA.
If I could just add to that real quick too, is when it comes to that innovation, is we see it in so many different fields that these printers are everywhere. And I think that leads to a lot of people using them and thinking of innovative ideas. And so if we want those printers to be more proliferous in the medical community, I think the FDA should spend more time figuring that out, because it could lead to much more innovation and change. But it would be nice, again, to go from just a handful of printers to many, many, many throughout. I think we'd see a lot of more enabling technology come from 3D printing.
I see. So doctor level innovation in response to the ability to design their own. So Karcher, in the 510Ks that you and I have been looking at, the use of additive manufacturing has been at the design stage or also at the manufacturing stage?
It's at the manufacturing stage too. Yeah, there's at least over 100 devices that have gone through the 510K process. Now, when it comes to us identifying where they are, it's difficult because a lot of people aren't trying to highlight that process of whether they use it or not. But we could see it in companies like local ones like Nuvasive. They create spinal cord implants, and they rely heavily on using the advanced technology to create again, it's very enabling. It's not just they 3D print for fun. It's because it actually helps their technology.
I see.
Better.
So technologies that wouldn't otherwise be able to be manufactured are being manufactured by 3D printing. It's not just 3D printing replacing existing.
Right. Personalized medicine is of course an area, but also
yeah, totally. Given the risk that Stacey mentioned and the uncertainty around regulation, I think. So hopefully we can discuss that more. So Dr. Friedman has actually done some research on this exact topic, but in other fields, and how regulation responds to new and evolving and uncertain technologies in biomedical sciences. And so I'm going to ask him to give us an overview of that and maybe what he thinks that might suggest for regulation in the 3D printing space.
Thanks very much. I'm going to deal with another very generic technology, and one that's been around for far longer than 3D printing, and that's biotechnology. And in fact, the first biotechnology product was reviewed by the FDA, and this was using biotechnology to engineer bacteria to produce human insulin. And this was in the early 1980s. It's been a life-changing product for diabetics across the world. And it really encouraged the federal government to think about how would this new technology, this very broad technology, be used in other fields. And at the time, there's obviously a series of existing laws. None of those laws addressed biotechnology. None were passed when at the time that biotechnology existed. So in 1986, the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House brought together the relevant regulatory agencies, the FDA, USDA, the Department of Agriculture, and the Environmental Protection Agency, and said, our goal is not to pass new legislation, but to use existing legislation to deal with new technology. How could we do this? What OSTP, what the Office of Science and Technology Policy decided to do was to put together a coordinating framework for the regulation of biotechnology. And this was released in 1986. FDA had responsibilities for human-related products of biotechnology, food products, drugs, and animal-related products, USDA plants, and EPA, unless regulated under other laws, would deal with microbes, bacteria. And this becomes an exercise of how do you make an old law fit a new technology. So in the case of the FDA, they use the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA, to regulate animal biotechnology as an animal drug. Say that again. How does that work? An animal drug. In fact, sometimes they stretch the sort of regulatory rubber suit even further, and they use their authorities, their responsibilities for regulating drug manufacturing facilities to regulate animal biotechnology. How would that work? Well, if you were to engineer an animal to produce a new product, you could consider that animal a drug manufacturing facility. So, a little weird. A lot of very creative thinking within FDA, but it worked at least for a while. USDA regulated plants using their authorities to regulate plant pests. This gets down to some arcane details of how the biotechnology was actually done at the time, that used tiny pieces of DNA, molecular products in the crop engineering process. EPA was also very creative. How do you just regulate a general genetically engineered microbe? And they said, well, if you engineer DNA, if you change the structure of the genome of the bacteria, the DNA of the bacteria, that's a new chemical. So they use their authority under the Toxic Substances Control Act, which regulates new chemicals, and they said, well, we're just going to regulate engineered bacteria in the same way that we regulate new chemicals. So what's the lesson of these is, as Stacey explained, that first step is legislation. The agencies can only do what the law allows them to do. And so sometimes we look at these, regulations that end up, and you kind of scratch your head and go, is this really the best way we can do it? And the answer is maybe in most cases with new technologies, no, but that's what the laws require the agencies to actually do. When regulating the products of biotechnology, the preference has been to regulate products. So when there are existing laws, pesticide laws or drug laws or dietary supplements, use those existing authorities and deal with them as both Stacey and Karcher explained, in ways that are similar to other products that are out there. Sometimes you have to get a little more creative and really deal with the process, and that often gets us kind of in trouble when you're kind of saying regulating a process itself. There have been a number of attempts to reform the biotechnology regulatory framework, this coordinated framework over the 35 years or so that it's been in existence. Most recently, over the last couple of years within the Obama administration, saw a lot of activity as some new technologies came in: synthetic biology, genome engineering with CRISPR. I'm sure all of you have heard of CRISPR-Cas9. Some of these new biotechnology methods that are out there, and the technology is like many areas of technology now, just moving faster than our regulatory reform efforts. So what do we do? What are some of the solutions that policy scholars are looking at, and many in government? And I just want to introduce two terms, which actually Stacey sort of started with, the difference between hard law and soft law. And hard law are the laws and the regulations, the stuff that's really backed up by agency actions. And soft law are like the guidance documents that she had in her third step. And FDA relies extensively on guidance documents. There are guidance documents on animal biotechnology, not just on medical devices. And again, they're non-binding guidance for industry. But in some fields, there really are other players that can be brought in. And in this whole area of soft law and thinking about soft law, typically folks talk about 3 players involved in the process: government, of course, industry as a second major player, and the third is non-governmental organizations, such as ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. Now, these are ways that we use these sort of soft law approaches. The agencies may have some hooks that they can use to make sure that what ISO puts out is adequate for safety and efficacy, as hard law would require, but it sort of engages others in the process directly, not so much during the formal rulemaking process, but it's a much more flexible, one hopes, faster process. And again, lots of experimentation going on. When nanotechnology sort of appeared on the scene, people looked at biotechnology and said, well, maybe we can do nanotechnology regulation, hard law, soft law, better than biotechnology, and lots of experimentation has gone on in that area. Many soft law experiments have been applied to environmental protection. The Green Seal and Energy Star that you see on your refrigerator and all these sorts of things are NGOs and industry and government involved with collaborative programs. So with that, I'll just sort of stop as one idea for dealing with these very general types of technologies.
Yeah, that was super helpful, and I think ties really well into what Karcher and Stayce said and where we're trying to go with this discussion as well. So I think there are several things that have come up and that I'm hoping we can talk about. The first is that the FDA is dealing in an environment of uncertainty because we don't know which way 3D printing is going to go. As Karcher mentioned, the technology is changing so fast. And if they were to introduce regulation right now that didn't properly address where technology is going or the direction of this technology, then consumers could be deprived of important innovation, and patients may not be as safe as they otherwise would. And so soft law presents an opportunity for the FDA to kind of put off formal regulation as they wait and see what direction this goes in. And, soft law is great in that respect, but it poses a cost in that it's uncertain. So once we have regulation, firms know which way to go. They know what standards they're being upheld to. They can invest in that direction as a result. And experimentation can be particularly expensive for smaller firms with less capital. And so even the soft law has a really meaningful impact. I mean, we've seen evidence of this on the direction of innovation in this space. And Karcher mentioned this point that even in the 510Ks that we are seeing mentioning additive manufacturing, they're kind of hiding it, and it seems like they don't want scrutiny on that. And it could be because they don't know how the FDA is going to respond, and this has meaningful impacts on the direction of innovation. So I'm wondering if, Stayce, you might be able to say something about how you've seen uncertainty in the regulatory space impact the types of applications or the direction of innovation, if you have any insight on that or experience with that.
Uncertainty is kind of an interesting term. I mean, I think that every medical device has some uncertainty surrounding it, and the agency recognizes that. And, that's actually a big part of what your review is doing. So just also, I just want to again point out, I'm not representing the agency right now, but when I was there, we did do a lot of reviews, and there's always some amount of uncertainty. And a big part of what you're trying to do is to understand what that uncertainty is and what the risk of that uncertainty. So some things that have been around a lot, for a long time have very little uncertainty, whereas some of these new technologies have a really great amount. The agency's not unexperienced with that. They do put out devices that have, even a large amount of uncertainty. I can give an example is the artificial pancreas, which is a device that automatically doses insulin for somebody with diabetes. And there's still, was a decent amount of uncertainty, but the agency recognized that the benefits were really tremendous. And so went ahead and kind of approved that. That being said, they did just recently put out a draft guidance on uncertainty and how that can be taken into account in the review process. So that's one area that they've been trying to take what has kind of been done and make that more clear to the public. But there always will be this level of uncertainty that's there. Some of the other ways that they're, I think, kind of trying to deal with some of this is by like you suggested, or has been kind of suggested. I haven't actually heard the term soft law, but I think using these like standards organizations and other organizations to help put out sort of current level of thinking, and a lot of these people are academics or experts in this area, and there are some areas that FDA is not experts in, so they'd rather have the experts be putting out sort of what the appropriate guidelines might be, and they can also update those more easily, as was mentioned, because as we all can see, Congress is not, passing legislation is a difficult and arduous process. So, having other groups that might be able to do that a little more quickly with the most up-to-date knowledge going into it, I think is often preferable. Another thing that I think that they try to do is really being innovative on some of these things. So one of the, and a recent example is this whole software pre-certification program. So this is a program where I think, again, the FDA realized like we cannot regulate software that is changing every single day the same way that we are regulating a medical, an older medical device that has already kind of been optimized and doesn't need those kinds of changes. So instead of saying that we're going to review every piece of software and every documentation, of that software validation, we're reviewing that an organization is able to do to make good software products. They have good processes and procedures, and they have, done the due diligence to show that they can make software and update and innovate, and we review that they can do that, and then the agency doesn't necessarily review every piece of software they put out or every time they change it. And I think some of those things might be spread to further areas, and some of these might be like in this 3D printing area where it just might not be technically feasible to review every single iteration of some of these things.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
If I could add on to that too. No, Dr. Beck, I think that's a good point, that it relates to 3D printing. And Dr. Friedman used the term soft law, which I think is that a common term, Dr. Friedman, too? I believe you if it is. I just haven't seen it.
Yes, among policy geeks. I don't think you're going to see it in the New York Daily News or whatever. Gotcha.
No, I just think that that's a great term, because when I read that technical guidance document for 3D printing for the first time, I was actually very bothered by how soft it really was. They constantly went back and said, these are only our thoughts. There are considerations. These aren't mandatory. And sometimes when going through it, I felt like it fueled more uncertainty, because it it gave suggestions that the FDA was concerned with certain areas or completely oblivious of others. Because I do agree, it's changing all the time. It's just where does this soft law turn into law? And then I guess another question that I have is that when it comes to soft laws, I think that it's on the backs of industry that it's being developed, and that's good to keep them in the conversation and the dialogue. but where's their incentive to build this soft law? Because I think a lot of energy and investment goes into that knowledge and technology of safety that I don't know if, if you share with others what you do to make your process more safe, isn't that kind of letting people know your secrets or your where your worries and investments in the future align? I guess I wonder where that incentive is for them to contribute.
Some of these are, especially smaller firms are between a rock and a hard place. Again, going back to this area of biotechnology, universities all across the country have the capability and are experimenting, developing new crop strains for that useful societal purposes. And it's $3 million to get through the regulatory process. And so what you see is, unless there's a huge market, unless it's corn or soybeans or sugar beets, it just doesn't happen. Nobody can afford that. So I think the incentive of the more flexible process is it just puts you in the hard place rather than against the rock. You at least stand a chance of entering the process of working together. Clearly, some of these things have to be in a pre-competitive mode. Again, I'd like to bring the concept that FDA mostly is government industry. They do have some guidance on how to deal with NGOs, with standard setting organizations, but they're they're not as experimental as some of the other agencies have been. And so if you can, especially in some of these areas where in fact you can get together and set standards, telecommunications industry is, I don't know what the right percentage is, but 95% self-generated industry-wide protocol standards, et cetera, and a wee bit of regulation that gets thrown on top of there.
Yeah.
So it can be done. It has to be tailored to the individual products and to the, never mind the products, to the individual problems that you're facing. The goal isn't just innovation, it's safety, it's efficacy, it's innovation, it's lowered cost, and it takes a village to make some of those things work.
Yeah, it's incredibly complicated. I want to ask one more question to the panel and then get to the audience questions. Karcher mentioned, like, when does soft law become hard law? And I think 3D printing has a lot of overlaps with biotech in that it seems like many aspects of 3D printing will have to be regulated. So right now we're regulating some of the output when the output looks very similar to existing products, but regulating the manufacturing process for risky medical devices, regulating the testing of the output, regulating who can do it, how it can be done, how risky the devices can be to be 3D printed, and so on. And I don't see a resolution of uncertainty on any of these things anytime soon. So what does that mean for when firms might expect regulation, formal regulation, to be introduced? And how does the FDA decide at what point they regulate?
Well, so this is Stacey. I think that we have to be a little bit careful on the different terms we use. So
yes,
when we say like hard law, that I think really is legislation, and then maybe regulation, although regulations aren't considered laws. But yeah. Those things are legislation particularly is very general in the sense that I wouldn't really expect that Congress is going to take up a specific topic like 3D printing or any specific topic and make legislation specifically around it, because legislation really has to apply to everything. So it tends to be a little more general. It tends to outline like that there needs to be a process to prove safety and efficacy, and that might be the whole law, or that portion of that legislation. A regulation is the agency's attempt to implement that law. And again, there are some more specifics there. In a lot of the regulations, they'll have specifics about identifying different devices. So there's, each device really has its own regulation, but that regulation is very short. It's a brief descriptor of it, and it just says like sort of the classification. So whether it's a high risk, low risk, or medium risk. And then there's general information, again, like that describes, what the 510K process is, or the quality system and good manufacturing processes. But again, the regulations don't often get into a lot of these specifics, other than maybe some what's called special controls that happen around specific devices that is potentially would be where this would go. But I think the agency has learned a lot about how hard it is to change those things. So it's in general not really preferable to put all of this into current thinking into regulations, because 20 years from now, that's no longer current, right? So I think they do tend to try to be a little more general in those areas, and then use guidance, which is a little, which can be changed a little bit more, and use like some of these soft law or standards agencies to really describe that. They also use decision summary. So as new products come on the market, that actually kind of shows like how the thinking has changed a little bit. So, maybe in the past they thought certain studies needed to be done, and as they start to come on, they see that maybe you don't have to do those studies, or you have to do new studies because things have, been learned. So I don't know that I would caution people, maybe don't expect that you're going to get a lot of regulation or legislation around it. You might get more guidance around it. But like Karcher kind of mentioned, and others, is that, this is an area that there is still a lot of uncertainty. It's rapidly changing. So even guidance, while it can be updated, is still reasonably time consuming. It takes a couple of years for guidance to get out there, and even longer to be finalized. So the agency is going to probably, I would anticipate, do more around like ways of thinking or considerations, as opposed to this is what exactly has to be done, because that it's harder to change when you get very definitive like that.
Yeah, I think one comparable thing that has happened recently is the idea of 3D printing a gun. And when hard laws need to come into place for something like that, because obviously that affects everyone, and of course the Second Amendment comes into play, and freedom of speech, all these different things in terms of regulating a 3D printed gun. I think that is the case because 3D printers are, again, so proliferous, right? They're everywhere. Whereas if they start getting to be in every doctor's office, I guess the one question when it comes to regulation on top of that and the guidance is, when does the guidance consider the manufacturer to not be a huge company in a big building in a warehouse, but the manufacturer is someone in a hospital setting or a point of source setting? Has there been anything that you could think of related to that?
For 3D printing in particular, I don't know, because I apologize, but that's just not my area of expertise. There are some things that could be drawn on for that. So in laboratory testing, there's what's called point of care testing. So that happens at the patient's bedside. So oftentimes, like when you go to the doctor and you get your blood drawn, that's done by a phlebotomist. It goes to a lab, and they have experts who run these big laboratory analyzers, and they do that. And so that's kind of the old traditional way of doing things. But technology has improved a lot so that this stuff these tests can be run at a point of care setting. So like a hospital bed, or when you just go into your doctor's office and they quickly do it. Even some of these, to take it even further, would be kind of patients doing it on themselves. So glucose meter testing, other, urine testing and things that they, pregnancy tests, they actually they take these things home and they do the testing themselves.
Yeah, that's like me building my own prosthetic.
Exactly. So instead of saying, instead of having there have to be, every single person who does their own glucose testing, having to get like authorized or something like that. The company shows that anyone can do it. So they get what like lay users or representative people and show that the device is made so simple, the testing is so simple that you don't need an advanced degree to be able to do it. You can understand the labeling. They do like user studies showing that they can understand the labeling. They can understand the results when they get them, and that they're able to run the test themselves. So I could see a sort of similar scenario here where at some point the 3D printer or whatever the program is that's, whatever's being made, the device is so simple to run and to do that you don't need to be an expert in it. And you could just have it set up so that at the hospital or wherever they can run it and do it themselves.
Yeah.
That being said, I think you have to do testing to show that and get there.
Yeah, it's very interesting area.
I think so. And I think that speaks to a big incentive for 3D printing manufacturers, that if they really want ubiquitous use of 3D printing in the medical device space, they have to standardize and make use a lot simpler than it currently is. So maybe that's a really important collaboration. As Karcher mentioned, he's a 3D printing expert trying to work with, in my opinion, he's a 3D printing expert trying to work with doctors. And I think that's going to be an important relationship. I want to get to the audience questions. We have some really good ones. I've seen several mentions of the role for scientists and policymakers to work together. I want to first kind of promo the Science Policy Fellows program at GPS, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. People like Karcher and other people in the sciences at UCSD coming to the policy school to work with us. And I know nothing about the technology of 3D printing, and I just would not have known how complex it was. And the uncertainty associated with it and the opportunities associated with it in the medical space. And we hope to publish our work, and we hope that it will contribute to, the guidance documents or the innovation process in firms. And I think, as Dr. Friedman pointed out, this dialogue between the FDA, industry, nonprofits is really trying to generate these conversations between scientists who are doing the innovating, firms who are trying to profit from the innovation, nonprofits that are trying to ensure industry and patient safety go well, and of course the FDA, which is the government. So I think that this dialogue, while costly in terms of time potentially, is really critical for good quality regulation. So there's a question from someone that asked if this stretching of existing regulation to new technology has ever gone wrong. And I know that there have been, of course, situations of medical devices or drugs being approved. It turned out they were riskier than maybe the FDA realized. I wonder if there's any kind of really notable examples, Dr. Friedman or Dr. Beck, that you can think of.
I guess that depends what you mean by gone wrong. There are some examples where it was stretched so far that people just decided this is pretty silly. And in fact, animal biotechnology regulated by FDA is one of those answers. And many of you have perhaps heard of a genetically modified mosquito that was proposed for field trials in the Florida Keys. And this was a mosquito engineered, sterile mosquito. You just release it and release enough of them, and it just drives the mosquito population down. And FDA asserted authority over this, regulating this product, and yes, they were regulating it as both an animal drug or a drug manufacturing facility, and people are going, you're regulating this as a drug, but what this modification is doing is like killing mosquitoes. That's not a drug. Drugs do good things for animals, not bad things for animals. And eventually, in fact, FDA did some rulemaking for about an experimental release, went through a whole environmental impact assessment process, and then backed off, and now the Environmental Protection Agency is regulating that mosquito as a pesticide. So yeah, I think, regulators can be very, very creative if given the opportunity. If the new technology just gets so far away from fitting in one area, perhaps it has to transition to a different agency to deal with it, who deals with things in different ways. But the goal is the same: the public safety, public health, efficacy of the product, and so on. So perhaps victory snatched from the jaws of defeat, but others would say, yeah, maybe we don't want that product anyway.
That's a great anecdote and example. Aaron has a question on predicate devices, which I think is actually really good. All the questions are really good, but I am also particularly interested in this question, so I'm being selfish as moderator. So this point, could a 3D printed item be approved based on something already approved, but in a different manufacturing process? I mean, that's what's happened so far with the 510Ks of additive manufacturing that have been approved. They're based on predicate devices, but now being 3D printed. Is that right, Karcher?
Yeah, and these are performance-based regulations. And the idea is that when you submit for FDA approval, and Dr. Beck, I'm sure, understands this better than I, and she could probably say, but when you submit, is you have indications that you're shooting for, that you want your device to achieve some type of performance. And what you're saying is your device is going to do those same things, and you're going to sell it by marketing those same indications. Now, the manufacturing process is part of your quality system, and that needs to be defined. And I think that can vary from group to group. But yeah, again, Dr. Beck probably wants to, or could talk about it more, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe Dr. Beck, you could particularly talk about the class 3 devices, the very high risk devices where there isn't a predicate, and whether the change in manufacturing, or there's not even a change because there's no predicate.
Yeah, so for something that's a class 3 device, you don't actually have to have a predicate, and in fact, you don't have a predicate, so you don't have to worry about it being the same type of technology. In that case, they are looking at the manufacturing and how that's done during the review. For a class 2 device that's a 510K, if it can have a predicate, the predicate does not have to be the exact same technology, but it has to be the same intended use. So, the intended use is based on how the device will be used and in what patient. So it's not necessarily how it's being made, it's what is being made and how it's being used. So I'm trying to think of like a good example, but I don't know any 3D printed devices that have been approved. I know Karcher could probably give me one.
Yeah, maybe give us an example, Karcher.
Yeah.
The one that I was using earlier was the spinal cord implant by Nuvasive, and spinal cord fusion, in between like an L4 and L5, spinal cord, that's been done many times before, but not with a 3D printed device. And that's when it was a 510K predicate that they used, and just different manufacturing. So. Right.
So it still had the same use, the same intended use though, to help with presumably some sort of spinal fusion. So I think that then they're not, and this is also important, is in 510K devices, they're actually not looking at the manufacturing process before it can be cleared. But that doesn't mean they don't have to have a good manufacturing process. So the company making it still has to have a quality system and follow all that stuff. It's just that the FDA doesn't look at it itself. So that's a big difference between a class 3 and a class 2 device.
And we haven't seen any class 3 devices be 3D printed, and I guess that would be the stage at which the manufacturing review would happen. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there, though, is the difference between having only hundreds of devices that are 3D printed versus having, thousands, when you're able to somehow navigate that in a different way. But obviously safety comes first, but hopefully, there's the innovation part to promote that.
Yeah. It looks like we are right at the hour. So I am going to thank you all. This was great. I learned so much, and it was great chatting with you. I feel like I could continue chatting with you for a long time. I hope our audience enjoyed, and we are very grateful you were here. I have a closing remark about the next webinar. So part of GPS is Designing Policy for a Global Impact series. We have a subsequent webinar on February 13th, which will feature my colleagues Craig McIntosh and Tibrat Garg, as they discuss the impact of safety net programs on health in developing countries. The other thing I'll note is that this webinar was recorded and will be available on the GPS 30th anniversary website. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening.